What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so picking up with the conclusion of No Justice, we kind of get a bit of a jump here. This is kind of an interesting thing. In the last video, we had talked about how at the end of the story, you basically had the destruction of Kol, more or less. You know, this planet that was inhabited by the race that Brainiac belonged to, and we didn't really know what happened to the Justice League. At this point, we pick up with the Source Wall, and it's kind of interesting here because the group's just somewhat there. Now, in truth, it's not like Snyder just kind of grabs this out of nowhere. It's not like, you know, and then suddenly they're at the Source Wall for no real reason whatsoever. It just sounds cool. It doesn't really fit in that way. Instead, what's going on here is, remember, all this stuff stems from the Source Wall, that the Source Wall had basically been broken, it had been damaged. Now this again is really Scott Snyder kind of breaking away from the status quo, because historically speaking in DC Comics, the Source Wall is what separates the main DC universe from like all the other universes that are out there. And the idea is that beyond the Source Wall is just the source of all things that exist. But it was always ambiguous, and we were never really told explicitly what it was. If you go back and you read the old Jack Kirby like Fourth World stories, you're more or less kind of told the source more or less seems to be God, but again, we're not really given a definitive answer. We're just kind of told that it's there. But with the Source Wall being broken, all these dangers are more or less pouring into the universe. And the whole basis behind this is that it really gives Scott Snyder almost infinite resources here. It gives him infinite villains to throw into the Justice League universe or the Justice League stories, because while we do know of a few people like Superboy Prime who were locked inside the Source Wall, most people we don't know anything about. They've always just kind of been backdrops. They've been like universal constants to the idea that they're just stuck in the Source Wall and we don't really know how they got there. And so because of this, there's all kinds of storytelling that can be told. Now, of course, with the arrival of the Omega Titans on Earth comes the SOS of Green Arrow. Oliver Queen basically being one of the last few heroes who were on Earth, really one of the only heroes who were on Earth, with everybody else kind of dealing with the conflict out in space. He, of course, sends an SOS out to the Green Lantern Corps, says, hey, look, the Omega Titans are here and we're all gonna die. And so this really kind of leads into like the aftermath of what's going on with regards to the destruction of Kolu. And the reason why this is the case is because when you pick up with these various members of these different Justice League teams, for the most part, they're all dealing with what essentially amounts to a catastrophic failure. And while it's not necessarily a failure in the worst way, it is still a failure, because in their minds, they were all brought together for the singular purpose of trying to save this planet and defeat the Omega Titans, or at least learn as much as they could in order to ensure the Omega Titans were defeated. The problem with this is that it didn't work out that way. Of course, we know Kolu was essentially destroyed entirely, but what also ended up happening here is it was the Justice League who was thrown into a situation where their only real source of knowledge, which came in the form of Brainiac, was destroyed by Amanda Waller. And so they were literally flying blind. So you can't really fault him for messing up here and for screwing up. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of things when you don't really have all the information available. But at this point, they begin turning their attention to Brainiac 2.0, the son more or less of Brainiac himself. And when the question's asked, can you help us out here? This is when Snyder starts to draw on this sort of darker, evil persona of Brainiac 2.0, when he basically says no. But here's the funny thing about this. This is one of the reasons why I love Snyder writing. It's not like this stereotypical villain like, well, no, because I'm a bad guy and that's what I do. Bad people fight against superheroes and I'm just gonna make life rough on you. That's not the stance he takes. Instead, what he really kind of argues here is the truth of the situation is that you guys have failed here. I mean, you know, it's inevitable that you guys were gonna fail. Sure, I could help you, but why would I? Like, you guys started all this. This all happened because of everything that happened in Dark Knight's Metal. Had you guys not broken the Source Wall, then none of this would have been a problem. So you guys are basically getting your just desserts. You're getting the consequence of your own actions. And that's kind of the interesting thing here, because when you look at the Justice League in terms of their team as they've existed and the various members who are part of it, it always seems to kind of follow this form and function of like a villain shows up and they fight the villain and they win and the day is saved. And this is kind of a cool situation because it's like, but the Justice League isn't really as great as they think they are. Like, they're not really that spectacular. They're heroes who do great things, sure, but they've screwed up catastrophically. Not only that, all this is because of them. This is all led to like them, like literally this all starts with them. And so it's really kind of saying like, you guys get your just desserts. Now in reality, it's basically holding 7 billion people accountable for the actions of a handful. But that's kind of the price you pay when you just sort of hand things over to the Justice League and say, run with it, you know, just make sure we stay safe. You know, that's kind of the way these things go. And so ultimately, Vril Dox actually takes his leave of the ship and simply says, I'm not fixing anything, and actually ends up traveling back to Earth. And this is kind of cool because when he arrives here, initially he sort of hits up Amanda Waller, right? Says, look, you know, you understand the nature of things. You defeated my father or killed Brainiac, and I'm going to kill kill you in turn, which of course, you know, results in the arrival of the Green Lantern Corps. Now, the Green Lantern Corps showing up here is of course in response to the SOS, but it's one of these things where it doesn't really seem like they could do a whole lot. And that's one of the things that's kind of cool here about these Omega Titans, the way that Snyder draws or really designs them, is they're kind of like this essence of the universe itself. Like they're a universal constant, a backdrop. They can't defeat it any more than like the universe itself can be defeated. And so because that's the case, the Green Lantern Corps, while they are cool and they are incredibly powerful, ultimately won't really be able to do a whole lot here. And in fact, that's one of the things that's addressed. You know, Real Docs basically says, hey, it's cool you guys are here, whatever. I don't really care because you guys can't do anything to stop this. Now, Amanda Waller's response is a lot more heavy-handed. What she does is she basically sat down and she had like nuclear weapons tied to all of these trees. And her belief was that if the trees were destroyed, then the Omega Titans would leave because the trees growing there are the only reason why the Omega Titans have arrived. And so it's kind of interesting because if anything, Amanda Waller has and will always be cutthroat. She is ruthless. She'll do whatever it takes to save the world. And when the response is made of like, think of the death toll that you'll have in this, the response of Amanda Waller is, but that's minuscule. And she's not wrong. Like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Now, of course, this goes directly into Cyborg really having his big moment. And this is kind of the cool thing because the Justice League starts to recall that like Brainiac, his database is on Earth. And this is when Oliver Queen steps up and says, yes, it's because Amanda Waller downloaded it prior to his death. And so this is where the Justice League begins to modify itself. And this is where we start to step into them actually being heroes because now they have more information to operate on. They actually have a plan that they can form here. And so they really just kind of hand everything over to Cyborg. And the question is, Cyborg, what do we do? And Cyborg's response is, well, all the other trees are dying except for the tree of entropy, which means the Omega Titan is going to consume that tree. And so what we have to do, or at least what Cyborg figured out anyway, is that what the Omega Titans are actually doing is they're feeding on the seeds that are born on these trees. That when you have all four trees that begin to grow, one of them will outgrow the others. The others will die, and whatever the nature of the planet is, if it's wisdom or entropy or mystery or what have you, that tree will grow. That tree will sprout seeds, and that's what the Omega Titans feed on. And so the response of Cyborg is just like fast track the growth of the seeds. Like grow those seeds as fast as possible and then supercharge them with energy of entropy and then feed it to the Omega Titan. And it's actually a really, really cool plan here because the hope of Cyborg is that with the Omega Titan basically being satiated with all this energy, because these Omega Titans aren't really like thinking beings, which is to say they're not really like humanoid in a sense, then the argument of Cyborg is they simply operate more on instinct. And the instinct is feed on planets that are rich in whatever that Omega Titan stands for. And so if the other Omega Titans see the one of entropy and then they realize that it's filled with all this entropic energy, then the response is consume that Omega Titan. They'll just be drawn to that energy and they'll consume it. It takes their attention away from planet Earth. Now, the other funny thing about this, and this is actually one of the things that I'm sad about, is that DC seems to be moving more in the direction of Lex Luthor becoming a bad guy. And the reason why is because entropy is really just kind of like chaos, lawlessness, a lack of order. And so when you have someone like Lex Luthor, who really does stand for like being a hero, and then Deathstroke says, I can't get this thing to work, and in turn, Lex Luthor takes it and charges it, what seems to be going on here is DC's continually pointing to the direction of the idea that Lex Luthor is going to become a bad guy. I personally don't like it. I think, you know, sending Lex Luthor back to being a bad guy is just kind of like sending things back to the way they were before, telling the same old stories that we've seen before. And so ultimately what they end up doing is, of course, putting the supercharged seed inside of a giant spear that's created by the Green Lanterns and firing it off into the entropy Omega Titan, which in turn literally overcharges it with more energy than it can handle and blows it up. But here's the funny thing. On the surface, we would look at this and we would say, hooray, the day is saved, the Justice League won. Like we would all celebrate and we would all be happy. But the reality of this is that Martian Manhunter kind of looks at everything that's gone on. And even when Lex Luthor kind of addresses this, you know, and really speaks with Martian Manhunter, they both kind of come to this realization that this was one, the tip of the iceberg, and two, they fractured the universe yet again. They made the same mistake they made before. And the reason why is because these Omega Titans are a fundamental force of the universe. That's why I say they're very much like Galactus. When you look at Galactus in Marvel Comics, he's a force of nature. That was established in the trial of Reed Richards. Galactus serves the purpose of maintaining cosmic balance by consuming worlds that would otherwise give birth to more Celestials, who in turn would overpopulate the universe. When it comes to these Omega Titans in DC Comics, they serve a universal constant. They keep the population of the universe in check by feeding on planets, basically, by literally keeping the universe from being overrun with life. With the Justice League looking at things from a narrowed perspective, what they've basically done is they've offset that balance. Planets that are basically rich in entropy will continue on, thriving and growing. And while that's not necessarily the worst thing, overpopulation is one hell of a thing. And that's what you run into in this universe, is the idea that there's basically going to be more people than there needs to be. And so as a result, the Justice League has done more harm on a much larger and grander scale than they could possibly ever imagine. But because they're human, because they're heroes, because they're looking at things from a very small perspective, they can't really see the bigger picture. So again, it is kind of intriguing here. Now, of course, this leads directly into things like the return of the of Justice, and a few little follow-ups that'll actually really be featured more in Justice League #1 if the interviews that Scott Snyder has done are to be believed. But this is kind of cool because from here, what Snyder does is he really kind of breaks it down, right? Like this is very reminiscent of the old X-Men comics. Like you read the old X-Men comics after Decimation and after the events running all the way up until like Messiah Complex, and then it's break them off into more X-Men stories. That's what's going on here. And in fact, really within DC itself, this is more akin to the post-crisis landscape in the sense that you originally had Justice League International and then Justice League Europe and then Extreme Justice and all these different teams that existed out there. What's happening is that in the aftermath of this whole thing, because teams have basically been formed, these teams are essentially going to continue on in the same capacity. Wonder Woman's joining Justice League Dark. You've got a new team called Justice League Odyssey, which really seems to be more of a modified Justice League International featuring Cyborg and Starfire and a few other characters. And then you've got the main Justice League team. So again, it continues on and really kind of branches off into 3 new titles, which actually look pretty awesome. But it is an interesting take on things. I mean, this of course was clearly a story designed to springboard into Justice League #1 proper, but I imagine it was really Snyder's way of just kind of creating a small story for himself and then going into the main Justice League title. It's a great story. I loved it. But still, it is kind of cool and it is a pretty interesting set of events. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like and I will catch you all later. Peace.